Okay, so our guest today is Nara Milanich, and this is the book we're going to talk about. We gotta. I think I gotta hide my face for the autofocus to work. Yeah, yeah. There we go. So this is your book, Paternity: The Elusive Quest for the Father. This was a really important book to me when I was writing father figure. And what the reason that I think it was so important to me is that what you do in this book is sort of break down. I mean, on the surface, you break down the history of paternity and how we came to think about paternity the way we do now. But what that meant for me, as I was trying to reimagine fatherhood identity, was just opened up this possibility of us recognizing all the ways that the scientific questions we ask are always grounded in social or cultural assumptions about what something means or doesn't mean. So I'm really excited to talk about that, to talk about changing the changing beliefs about what it means to be a father from the in the most literal way, which I think most people believe is something that's so fixed. And you do a great job of going, that's not really nearly as fixed as we think it is. Is that a fair characterization of the book?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, historians always like to tell you why things are not as fixed as you thought and why there is nothing new under the sun. And what we think is new is old, and what we think has always been is actually not the way it's always been. So that's definitely, I think, part of what I'm trying to do in the book. And I was thinking about the relationship between your book and mine. And in some ways, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you're interested in doing is thinking about, I mean, yours is a sort of prescriptive approach. What should fathers be doing, or what might they do better, right? And in some ways, the question that I'm asking is a more basic one, which is, who is the father in the first place? And that question of who is the father is also in turn tied up in questions of how fathers behave, or how they should behave. So the two questions are definitely related, but in a very fundamental way. My book is about who fathers are, who is considered to be the father, how have people understood that question in different ways, and how have they answered the question of who the father is differently over time, and across space, and in different social and political and economic contexts.
Yeah. So, well, then let's start with the most basic question. Our current conception of paternity as something genetic, as something that I can go get tested to find out, whether or not I'm the real father of a child. Like, when does that become, when is that normalized? Like, when is that what we think of now when you hear about people getting these tests? When does that happen?
Well, that's actually the question that I started with when I began this book. I can't even remember what I was reading something. I came across these crazy treatises published in the 1920s and 30s, written by Latin American authors, but I soon discovered it wasn't just Latin American authors who were writing them. And they were medical legal treatises about how one could know paternity. And they had all sorts of what I thought were quite remarkable ideas about how one might be able to trace physically a father, whether by using fingerprinting or analyzing facial resemblance or using blood types, et cetera. And when I ran across those treatises, the first question I asked was the one that you asked, which is, wait a second, when did we have DNA tests? They're such a familiar part of our um, contemporary society, right? You can turn on the TV and see 23andMe ads. You buy them, with a discount for Father's Day, or Mother's Day. Yes, they do sometimes go on sale for those holidays. So they're such a familiar part of our sort of contemporary world that it's as if they've always existed. But it turns out the DNA testing is really, really recent. It's only in the 1980s that the technology known as DNA fingerprinting emerges that allows us to say with a very, very high degree of probability that a given individual is the father or mother of another individual. And it's really only in the 1990s that those technologies become commercialized. And of course, we are where we are today. And this industry has experienced really exponential growth, even in just the last few years. So it's a really recent technology. And even the ideas underlying DNA technology, this idea that science can tell us who the father of a given child is also relatively recent. And my book is about how that idea really emerges in the 1920s. Before that, yes, people have an idea of physical kinship, of biological generation, and yet very often it's law rather than science that determines who the father is before that time. So it's really in the 1920s that people, scientists, but also jurists, lawyers, and general publics get excited about this idea that a scientific proof of paternity is possible. And that it's desirable. It could serve an important social function to be able to know who the biological father is. And so my book is about the emergence of those ideas starting in the 1920s and why they emerge in the 1920s, why this idea of a scientific paternity test first surfaces, and the different uses to which it is put over the course of the 20th century and down on into the present.
So how did this notion of fatherhood, I mean, that's a pretty dramatic shift in the 1920s for that to suddenly have that scientific backing. Can you, this is probably hard for you to summarize because I imagine it takes an entire book or multiple to explain this, but can you point to any fundamental differences in the idea of what it means to be father as a result of that change and that what really influences our thinking today?
Yeah, so I think, if I had to summarize that shift, it is the shift from social paternity to biological paternity, which is to say, science, both the idea of a scientific paternity test makes possible, but also emerges from the idea that the biological progenitor is the father. That is a relatively new idea. It is not the case that biological progenitors are always considered fathers, and that all biological progenitors are considered fathers. So let me give you a couple of historical examples that which some of which will sound familiar and others not. Take the case of Atlantic slavery. Slave children the paternity of slave children was very often erased, not because it was not known who their father was, but because it served the social order and the political order of slavery to not know who their father was, because as we know, sometimes that father was the master, right? And so that's an example of where paternity was purposefully erased, right? And we can think of other examples of where paternity is legally or politically erased. In the case of colonizers who engender children in faraway lands, or soldiers stationed abroad, right? Those are instances where it's not always helpful to know who the father is. It might be better actually to not know who the father is. And so what I argue happens in the 1920s is, this scientific interest in paternity, but also a new way of understanding who the father is and why we should know who he is. That there is a social value in identifying who the biological progenitor of a given child is. And I suggest that that's new. That in, for example, the 19th century, very often paternity was defined in social terms instead. So what does that mean? What does it mean to say paternity is defined in social terms rather than biological terms? An example would be the ways that many legal systems defined husbands as automatically the fathers of their wives' children, even if the evidence suggests that husband could not be the father for some reason, the biological progenitor for some reason. Nevertheless, law assigned paternity to husbands kind of automatically. That's an example of a social definition of paternity as opposed to a biological one, because of course we know that husbands don't necessarily have to be the biological progenitors of their wives' children. One could imagine alternative scenarios, but for the law's purposes, marriage makes the father. So that's an example of a social definition of paternity. And for that matter, the example that I gave of slavery is also a social definition of paternity. It's a definition of non-paternity, really, right? Where people aren't interested in knowing who the biological progenitor is because it's not in the interest of society to know.
I have so many questions. Wait, go ahead.
well, before, I want to take a step away from the 20th century for 1 second, and I want to go, what if we go all the way back to the ancient world, right? So we most of us know examples from the Bible, birthright, things like that. In the Odyssey, we have all this stuff about, fathers and sons recognizing each other and what that means. I guess there's even in a lot of Greek mythology this idea that a hero can be, I guess all mythology, that a hero is partially the father's a god. So I guess what I'm trying to how do you, and I guess we can only imagine, right? How do we imagine that shift? Like how did ancient people think about this then? What was the father from an ancient perspective?
Yeah. So I would not say that I really deal with that in any kind of detailed way in my book. I do sort of gloss a long history of literary and legal and medical conversations about what the father is. And, we could quote Shakespeare and we could quote the Odyssey and the Bible and, Solomon dividing the baby in half. And for a historian, historians are always suspicious when people, make blanket statements about human history, right? And so I gloss that history a little bit in my book, but I don't do a lot with it. And I actually think some historians that I've engaged with have been critical of that. Oh, you can't say that everything is the same before the 19th century, and they're absolutely right. But I did feel the need to give a sort of prehistory of the 20th century. You have to know something about what happens beforehand in order to know what changes, right? To make a case about change over time. But what I can say is that to me, an important part of this story is actually the 19th century. I see a kind of obsession with the identity of the father emerging in the 19th century. It's not that, people talked about it in Shakespeare and they talk about it in the Odyssey and they talk about it in the Bible. But the 19th century, those novelists, the Charles Dickenses of and a number of other authors are really concerned with this question of identity, right? The orphan story, right? The scrappy orphan who has to make his way in the world. Those are stories about identity and the extent to which biological versus social identity shapes, right, one's trajectory in life. So it's a literary trope. There are also a lot of stories in the 19th century about. I'm thinking, for example, the Brazilian author Machado de Assis, who's probably the best known 19th century Brazilian novelist, who wrote a book about organized around this father who comes to doubt his paternity of his wife's child. That's a recurring trope in 19th century literature. So we see it in literature, we see it in law. There's a lot of discussion in legal codes that emerge in the 19th century, trying to fix who is a father and what a father is, and biological versus social definitions of paternity. And we can also see it in social theory. Think of, for example, Engels. Engels, Marx's interlocutor, was also really interested in paternity, as were a whole series of kind of armchair anthropologists, social theorists in the 19th century. Sorry. They were very concerned with how ancient peoples or early human societies, primitive human societies, understood or didn't understand the father. So there's a real interest that emerges in the 19th century, which is not what my book is about, but I think it's an important prehistory to what happens in the 20th century. There's a concern with the idea that paternity is uncertain, that it can't be known, that as much as we'd like to know who the father is, as a 19th century French jurist says, paternity is as mysterious as the source of the Nile. And I love that refrain, and it captures a lot of the ways that 19th century people, so whether social theorists or jurists, thought about paternity. And that's the backdrop for the 20th century, when all of a sudden, actually, it's not that mysterious. I think if we had the right scientific technique, we actually might be able to know where the source of the Nile is, who the father is.
Well, I'm glad you brought that whole, that you described that in the way you just did, because it gets to my next question, which is what's even caught up in our 20th century, 21st century thinking of paternity is real question about heredity and patrilineage and the connection between monogamy and patriarchy and I know you cover a lot about this, so maybe you can explain. I know when I was describing this to Amanda, she was like, "Whoa, that's fascinating." So maybe you could explain some of that.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the story of the history of paternity is the story of the history of how people understand identity. But it's also a history of gender. Because, of course, the way that we think about paternity is very different than the way we think about maternity, right? And the ways that law and society have historically defined who the father is very different from how we understand who the mother is. So, in that regard, my book is a history of paternity, not just a history of parenthood, like genderless parenthood. And so,
wait, can I just take a guess here?
Yeah.
So was paternity basically all the power and none of the accountability? Is that what it translates to?
Yes, that's the epilogue. No. Yes. Well, I mean, okay, so in the first instance, to go back to this very basic question, not about what people should do, but about who is the mother or who is the father. Law has historically, in very different legal traditions, whether Islamic or Jewish or canon law or civil law or continental law, have all defined mothers and fathers in very different ways. We think about the biological contributions of male and female progenitors today as being the same, right? Both of them give gametes, and you're 50% your mom and you're 50% dad, right? My kid was studying mitosis the other day, and it's like, there they are, the little chromosomes, right? But that's not necessarily how people have historically defined maternity and paternity. So historically, maternity has been understood as certain. You can know who the mother is by the fact of pregnancy and birth. These are empirical facts you can observe with your eyes, and you can see this woman must be the mother. So, and according to Roman law, mater certissima est. The mother is super certain, right? But the father, incertus est. He is always uncertain, right? Because the fact of paternity, of biological paternity, is removed by 9 months from birth, and so there is no moment at which you can see who the father is. Well, I suppose there is, but a more difficult empirical question, right? So law has historically defined maternity and paternity as very different, and so then that then it justifies a very different legal regime surrounding paternity. Of like, okay, well, if it's not pregnancy and birth, it's not certissima, right? Like maternity, then how do we know it? And so then law has historically provided for a whole series of methods for knowing who the father is in different instances. Maybe it's the guy that's married to the mom, right? Maybe in the case of unmarried parents, it's the man who has demonstrated or performed a relationship with the child by giving it money or providing for the wet nurse, right? These social behaviors. So all that is to say that maternity and paternity are defined in very different ways, according to sort of law and social custom. So that's part of the story of what's different between paternity and maternity. And the other piece of this is not just how we know it, but what these two relationships confer. And in patriarchal patrilineal societies, paternity is associated with all kinds of resources and I guess I would call them resources that maternity is not. Identity, a name, patronym, property, right? Patrimony, like all these words are patrimony, patronym. It tells you they're connected to the father, right? And so because of this, because we live in a patrilineal, patriarchal, society, paternity has had historically a special importance or significance. I think it is understood to confer certain things to children that maternity does not. So that's another important, I think, distinction between the two.
So if there was this big shift in the 1920s where beforehand you said it was primarily legal and social, and then after the 20s it became biological, it seems as though, and I'm not a historian or an academic, so I could be wrong, but it seems as though these massive changes happen because they serve the greater social belief system at that particular time. What was the advantage of moving to a biological determinism for the first time? Was there what was the upside of doing that? It just seems like it would break down the social order that existed.
Yeah. Well, one sort of benefit of thinking, you're absolutely right. And actually, you've just anticipated like sort of the second argument of the book, which is even as these new notions of biological determinism and a biological paternity emerge and become very powerful, at the end of the day, they are not hegemonic in the sense that social definitions of paternity endure alongside the biological ones. And in essence, what a scientific test of paternity does is not inscribe biological determinism.
What's hegemonic mean?
Hegemonic, all powerful. So these biological ideas do not become all powerful. They're existing side by side, not only side by side, but in tension with the social, the older social definitions. So what scientific methods do, these perfect, fabulous, powerful, potent methods of DNA that can know with 99% certainty who the biological father of a given child is, rather than inscribing or inserting or institutionalizing the notion of biological identity over and above social ideas, they really just create tensions between the biological and social.
Really?
They never obliterate social definitions of paternity. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Sperm donation. Do we consider sperm donors to be the fathers of the children whose gametes they engender? Wait, is that the right phrase? Right? Do we consider sperm donors to be fathers? Most courts would say no, they don't. There's an example of where where paternity is not determined by biology, but by something social. The will and intent of the man to be the father in a case of sperm donation, probably you have not necessarily signed on to be the father figure of the children created with your sperm, right? So that's an example, one of many that I could give you, in which a social definition of paternity endures in the face of DNA evidence. There are also, a zillion court cases in various courts around the world, which downplay the importance of a DNA test and suggest that the real father of a child is the man who raised that child. That's a social definition of paternity, right? That exists alongside the DNA evidence. And so the argument is that, yes, we have these very powerful scientific ideas about biology and biological determinism that emerge in the 1920s, but they never displace the older social ideas. They merely sit alongside them and actually just create greater tensions with them. And so we always, people always knew before DNA that there was a tension between the social and the biological, but DNA really makes that tension, it lays it bare in a way that it wasn't quite so obvious before. So when you have a court case involving, a DNA test that says this man is the father, but this one raised the child, and then the court has to decide who is the one that has rights and responsibilities towards that child. That tension between the biological and the social is laid bare if you have a DNA test that says with 99.99% certainty that this dude is the biological progenitor and this one is not. And you didn't always have that, right? That's new.
Wow, this is a confusing subject. I'm so glad you're writing books on it.
Well, as my own child would tell me, how could it possibly take you 7 years to write that book, Mom? So, so it is confusing, and it's one of the things that I think history can do is show us that certain things that we don't assume ever have a history actually have a history. That ideas that we take for granted, are not actually the way that humans have always thought about them. And I think this is an example of that paternity is a really good example of something that seems on its face so self-evident, but actually turns out to have a history in the sense that people in the past have thought about it in radically different ways than we do today.
I'm interested in, and you touch on this in the book. I think quite a bit actually. The way, I mean, you already said a bit about the obsession with identity. I think you call, there's an identification revolution, I think is a term you use at one point in the book. But I'm curious about how this question about identity and fatherhood, but also childhood, the geek in me who knows a lot about the history of developmental psychology is noticing that there's a real connection between when paternity shifts and also as we start to think about the image of the child as a very different thing. I'm not. I try to tell my children all the time that the only reason I had them was so that they'll mow the lawn and do the labor, but they don't believe me. So there's sort of this shift to the burgeoning of the child's identity, and that being the responsibility of the mother, but also the father, which I imagine is a big difference in how we think about father figures historically.
Yeah. So one of the arguments that I make is the reason. I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons that paternity and the scientific quest for the father emerges in the 1920s, and it has to do with the history of science and new ideas about heredity and eugenics. And here's where we start to move into race science. I think there's a whole connection there between paternity science and race science. But it also emerges because of new social and political ideas. And one of them has to do with the emergence of the idea of children's rights. So historically, children had been seen as, beneficiaries of charity, perhaps, but not necessarily as bearers of rights. So that idea of children's rights emerges starting, say, in the 1920s and 30s. And it is not by chance that that is the moment when paternity science emerges. This idea that a child has a right to a father is a really new idea. And it becomes really powerful, right? But it's new. The idea of a right to an identity, the idea that you have a right to know who your biological progenitors are or something about your biological origins, which adoptees have articulated so powerfully, which children born of assisted reproductive technologies and donated gametes have articulated very powerfully. That's a new idea. So you're absolutely right that the history of paternity is also tied up in the history of childhood and new ideas about children and about the rights that they bear vis-a-vis their, progenitors. So that those discourses become really obvious starting right at the time that biological paternity tests are being experimented with. And in fact, some scientists see themselves as working in the service of justice. We will serve, the poor, orphaned, and abandoned children whose fathers refuse to recognize them. And once we come up with just a good enough scientific test, we will, have served the cause of children's welfare and well-being.
Go ahead.
I have so many questions. So, it's very much of the moment to be talking about patriarchy and crush the patriarchy, and all of our problems contribute or because of patriarchy. And so your book comes at a really, I think, interesting time in which we're really trying to understand how this power structure remains so gosh darn powerful. Is there any big ahas that came out of writing your book that you would like to translate to everyday feminists that may not be in our vernacular that you think would be useful for us to know?
Wow, that's a great question. Any big ahas? That's a loaded question. Any takeaways for feminists? I think that feminists and feminist historians have been really good at identifying the social nature of gender and really pushing back against biological determinism. But when I was doing my research and sort of reading around how feminist historians and feminist scholars of science and technology have often talked about these issues, I was struck by the fact that they often took for granted this notion that the father is inherently unknown and the mother is certissima. The mother is biologically certain. Like it was striking to me that many authors didn't question those assumptions. I ended up thinking, as I was writing my book, that the whole idea of unknown paternity, the whole idea that the father is unknown and can, that long-standing social idea, is an idea that is not rooted actually in biology, but in ideology. It's an ideological conceit rather than a biological truth. And so I wrote the history, or what I ended up thinking about my book as the history of that political and ideological idea. And so maybe that's something
that feminists would want to know that today, because it's part of the narrative that we're reinforcing by not having articulated that so clearly, that men are somehow less a part of the parental picture than they actually were. That was me trying to interpret what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I don't go that far in the book. I think we can leave that open, what it does for us to recognize the social and political nature of paternity, but to put paternity into history and into politics and take it out of just a discussion of biology is really, I think, important. It helps us to see how all of these conversations that we have nowadays about DNA, which often sort of end up reverting to, yes, but the DNA evidence says ... as if biology is the final arbiter. I think looking at the history invites us to realize biology is never the final arbiter, and giving it the status of final arbitration is itself a social idea that serves certain interests over and above others.
And did our viewers realize they were going to get this level? It's like we're back in college, and those like fascinating. Oh, this is so good. I can stay here all day. What else do you have to ask?
Well, I only have a few more questions, which is I was hoping you'd give us. I want to move back into the 20th century, and I was hoping you'd give us some of the examples of the crazy ways that we have gone about trying to establish paternity, because I just I find that real, to me that's like the entertaining, that was the like pulp of your book is the silly things we thought we thought proved something once.
Yeah. So there were all long before DNA, people studied the human body and tried to identify incontrovertible traits that might communicate the relationship between a given father and a given child. And they looked at blood types, which actually turns out to be a rudimentary, but nevertheless not bad way of looking at of establishing kinship. So looking at hereditary ABO blood types and knowing that certain blood types are compatible with others, and therefore certain combinations of blood types produce children of certain blood types. So that's one method, but there were a lot of others that have fallen by the wayside. Fingerprints, for example. Fingerprints apparently actually do have some hereditary bases. We think about fingerprints being used for individual identity, right? But there are in fact hereditary, certain hereditary characteristics of fingerprints. And so fingerprint scientists, and this was actually a field, a recognized scientific field, thought that if they could just sort of unlock the key to fingerprints, they might be able to use them to look at the fingerprints of a given individual and determine whether they are related to another individual. They never managed to do that, but they were very hell-bent on figuring that out. And they studied, thousands and thousands of fingerprints of parents and children trying to find like recognizable connections. So fingerprinting was another technique. Still another, studying the face, measuring particular characteristics of the face, the nose, the shape of the eyes, ears, this, I don't even know what this is called. It has the shape of one's ears, nodules on the ear, which were believed to be, or apparently are, hereditary. So there are all these different methods, but the idea, earwax. There was a
earwax.
Yes, apparently earwax. The distinction between like sticky and hard earwax is hereditary, and
they were really grasping at straws here, weren't they?
Yes, they were. But one of the things that I want to argue in my book is, I too found these absolutely fascinating and perplexing as methods. But I want to emphasize how at the time, like it's easy, we have the hubris of hindsight, right? We can say, oh, well, that obviously fingerprints isn't going to work and earwax. But, but obviously blood groups are a way to know something about heredity. But that's obvious to us ex post, but it's not obvious at the time. Right. And not only that, but so I think there's a certain humility that we have to cultivate in thinking about our, historical forebears. They may have had crazy ideas, but they didn't. That's only obvious, ex post. And the other thing is that many of these methods were actually used. They were recognized, some of them in courts of law. And so even though I would suggest that even though they didn't work, in our contemporary definition of work, they still did work. Which is to say, they still performed certain important functions in a court of law, even if they didn't actually tell the judge who the father was. They, for example, might have, given a certain legitimacy to, to a legal decision, right? Oh, because it's science. So it doesn't always matter if the science works or not for it to have power.
Yeah, and I think what you're hinting at there is, and it's back to this idea of identity, is this idea that we use the science to answer questions, but our notion of what a father is in any way is a cultural creation, and whether we're gonna identify that as something biological or fingerprint or your fingerprint, or to me that's such an important idea, because it's what allowed me in father figure to be able to go, hey, if it's changed so many times, we can change it anytime we want.
That's a great. So maybe that's the answer to your question that you asked earlier about what insights can feminism, take from this history. If it's changed so many times before, can't you change it again? Yes.
Be whatever we want it to be to serve us all in as best of possible way as we can.
Exactly.
We've been talking a lot about biological determinism, but what were some of your discoveries, either that you went looking for or that you were unexpected, around sexual biological determinism, gender determinism, around the role of father? And I can be more specific about this question, but I'm personally very interested in how much it seems like we oversubscribe sexually derived characteristics onto character and personality traits. And I'm wondering if that was part of your work at all or not.
It wasn't. I would say that in general, my book is really pressing against ideas about biological determinism, that fathers are a certain way because of biology or mothers are a certain way because of biology. And I do think that sometimes, so when I talk about the uncertainty, the elusive quest for the father, I'm not saying that fathers are actually uncertain. I'm saying that people thought they were uncertain. And that touched off a whole, right? But it's amazing. I've definitely read a number of reviews of my book that seem to think that that's actually what I'm saying, that I buy into this history, which is sort of interesting. So I'm really pushing against biological determinism and definitions of fatherhood and motherhood and paternity and maternity that rely on some biological essence. Because at the end of the day, for me as a historian, biology is itself a social idea. It changes over time. How we the
but boys like trucks and girls like dolls, right? And you can't deny this,
right? Or so we say. Go back 10 years and we will find, right. Or 50 or 100, right? So I really ultimately my book is an argument with biological determinism. At the same time, I also want to respect, a lot of the people who have thought most profoundly about these issues are people like adoptees, people who have been cut off from their genealogical genetic origins for some reason, and who feel really strongly that biology and biological identity and rights to your origins, et cetera, is really important, right? And so I want to respect that position also. I don't want to say, yes, but history tells me that biology doesn't mean anything, so this is all in your head. I think people can feel however they want about, biological origins. But I do hope that understanding that people haven't always had that understanding of what makes for an origin or a progenitor is might also be helpful to people who are, searching for their identities.
So then what would you say, imagine I'm a fifth grader. I teach marketing, so this is something I say often. How would you explain to a fifth grader the why, the ultimate why of why you wrote your book?
Oh, that's a good question. I wish I had some fantastic story about how I did a DNA test and I discovered that my father is not my father, but I have not done that.
No, it doesn't have to be that. It could be just an ideal or a vision.
Yeah, of why I wrote my book.
Or a fascination.
Yeah. That's a great question. You'd think I would have like a really profound answer, having spent 7 years writing this book. I think, I guess, the reason that I hesitate is that my answer has changed over time.
Well, actually, I'm much more interested in the reason that it is now, because of course, when you write a book, that the problem you thought you were solving for morphs 15 times. So
exactly.
What's the reason now that you're like, I'm really glad I spent 7 years writing this book?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I discovered for myself that perhaps would be obvious to other people, but was not obvious to me, and that I think is important, is to write paternity into the history, not just of family and kinship and gender and childhood and sexuality, but also to write paternity into the history of race and the way that we think about race. And so a lot of the book is concerned with particular historical episodes in which paternity testing ultimately serves the aim not just of knowing who fathers are in order to reconstruct or deconstruct families, but to identify the boundaries of race and nation. Yeah. And I realize that sounds really vague.
No, it makes complete sense in this context. I think everyone will really understand why that matters, because of all of these false limitations and ideas that are imposed upon one once we know all of these things, and our society's seemingly endless desire to put everyone in these boxes so that they can be compartmentalized.
Right, exactly. So when people are searching for their origins, sometimes, and they take that 23andMe test that they got on sale for Father's Day, sometimes they're interested in family members, right? Identifying progenitors, siblings, et cetera, long lost cousins. But often what they're interested in is race, right? Or ethnic origins. And so what those tests promise us is not just knowledge of people, of individuals in our family tree, but they also promise us some truth about our racial or ethnic origin or identity. And that's really powerful. And the fact that those tests are promising those two things at once, which seem distinct but are actually really related, I think is really important and interesting and powerful and problematic. And that's also part of what my book is about, to write that, again, paternity and kinship into the history of race and nation and how people think of identity.
Great and unexpected reason.
Is there something that you wanted to tell us about the book that we didn't ask about?
You didn't ask me who the guy on the cover was.
Oh.
The answer is I do not know. I call him, thanks to my friend who calls him the creepy white guy. He, as far as I know, I mean, he could be like the book cover designer's cousin. But other than that, I do not think he is actually a person. But some people think he is an actual individual. He is not, as far as I know. But he is the creepy white guy, we call him.
All right. Is there anything you want to ask us?
So tell me, I don't know, how is it useful for you to read or think about history for the purposes of your book?
Oh, well, there's a lot of history in my book. I mean, there's a lot of history in everything that I write because I approach things from the perspective of um phenomenology, really, and to do that, you kind of really need to tease out what is what's the how our perceptions have changed, how our subjective views of things have changed. It's about understanding all the different ways that we define an essence, how the ways we define something and think of it as essential, and the more you can understand the way that those trends have shifted over time, the more that you can tease out what's fashion and what has, and if anything has any staying power, what is actually essential. And so for when I started to write father figure, my goal was to try to tease out what is essential in is there anything essential in fatherhood? And I think very much as I moved through it, I discovered there really wasn't that much that we could imagine to be essential. There were lots of things where we could say, hey, these serve purposes at different times, and we have to evaluate if they serve purposes for this time and this context. But the idea that there was something essential didn't really hold up. And in that way, the book ended up being something different than I imagined when I started it, which is about. Which I guess to some extent is the same thing, is to ask and what you really inspired me to do was to go, how do these questions of, first biological paternity, but I think even as I got further into it, questions of patrilineage and property end up shaping the way we think about what a father is, and how are they still, how are still really old ideas about birthright or who gets to inherit the kingdom still shaping our idea of everyday behaviors in a world where those things don't really make much sense anymore.
Which is completely exhausting, which is why we're happy you do the work, because the faster you can get him to the phenomenology, the faster he can communicate it in a way that breaks this like really exhausting system that we're living in right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. Again, it's a book with ideas that I had been sitting with for a long time, not quite 7 years, but 18. Well, I think this book came out when I was in the middle of writing. Is that right? When did the book come out?
It came out in June 2019.
Yeah, so I was in the middle of writing it at that point, and I don't know how I found out about it, but I immediately got it and read it, and it's such a pleasure to be able to talk to you about ideas that have been bouncing around inside me and in my ideas for so long. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.